This is NBC Nightly News, Thursday, October 3rd. Reported by John Chancellor.
Good evening. Lawyers for Richard Nixon made it official today. They filed papers in Washington asking that the former president be excused from appearing as a witness in the Watergate cover-up trial. He has been subpoenaed by the prosecution and by one of the defendants, John Ehrlichman. Since Mr. Nixon is still in the hospital with phlebitis, today's move was not unexpected, but the way his lawyers did it was a bit unusual. Carl Stern reports.
Mr. Nixon's lawyers bypassed the normal filing procedure. Their report on the former president's condition and request that he be excused from testifying were delivered privately to Judge John Sirica. So intense was the judge's desire to avoid last-minute publicity about the case that he moved today's jury selection proceedings behind an armed guard and cordon. The press and public were excluded. The judge refused even to discuss the Nixon motions with the prosecutors or with John Ehrlichman's lawyers who subpoenaed Nixon. Ehrlichman's lawyers asked for a copy but didn't get one. Leaving the courthouse, Ehrlichman and his lawyer William Frady seemed upset about the secrecy but wouldn't comment.
On your behalf. Well, now, Carl, you know I can't talk about this case.
Lawyers indicated Mr. Nixon's motions cited both health and non-health reasons, including a statement from Mr. Nixon's doctor, various legal claims, and an implication that exposing Mr. Nixon to open questioning in court would jeopardize national security. The next move is up to Judge Sirica, who could order an independent medical examination of Mr. Nixon or that he be questioned in California. Carl Stern, NBC News, Washington.
This picture of Richard Nixon in the hospital was taken earlier this week by a UPI photographer, and it may be the last picture taken of the former president in the hospital. Today, a local newspaper photographer tried to take a picture. He says Mr. Nixon swore at him, called him an SOB, and startled him so badly that he forgot to take the picture. Mr. Nixon may be released from the hospital tomorrow, and some of his friends said today that he has built up $100,000 in legal bills and that they have set up a trust to handle contributions to pay those bills. Also in the news today, President Nixon's tape recordings and his future finances. We'll have a report. We'll also have another Inflation Watch report this evening, another look at how individual Americans have been affected by inflation. And we'll have a look at this Major League Baseball player who today became the first black man in American history to manage a Major League club. Those stories and others after this.
NBC Nightly News is brought to you by Exxon.
If you were an oil man, you'd look at the world two ways today. Suppose the size of each country were in proportion to the oil we know is under its land. The world might look like this to you. The Middle East would become this big, because this area has over half the known oil reserves in the world. Other areas are dwarfed by comparison. But if you looked at the world in terms of who actually uses the oil, it might look like this. The United States, which has only 5% of the known reserves, uses 30% of the world's oil. Western Europe, which has only 2%, consumes over 25%. Exxon has presented this look at the world of oil because one of our jobs is getting the oil from where it's found in the world to where it's used.
The Senate today passed a non-binding resolution urging President Ford to make public the results of all Watergate investigations. And there was a big debate in the Senate today on a bill to give the government custody of all the Nixon tapes and papers. That would overturn an agreement between Mr. Nixon and the Ford administration. Tomorrow, the Senate Appropriations Committee will consider a bill for Mr. Nixon's pension and expenses. Last night, the House made a big cut in his expense money. Ray Scherer reports.
The government has laid out more than $500,000 supporting Mr. Nixon, his homes in San Clemente and Key Biscayne, since he left Washington the 9th of August. The estimated total is $532,400 as of tonight. Figures supplied by the Budget Office show that it costs the government more than $9,800 a day for Mr. Nixon's staff, aides, servants, chauffeurs, and protection. In part because the government is spending so heavily on Mr. Nixon's behalf, the House was in an angry mood when it came to voting the money sought to pay for Mr. Nixon's transition to private life. The Ford administration recommended $850,000. The House Appropriations Committee sliced this by more than half to $398,000. Last night, an impatient House voted overwhelmingly to slash this even deeper to $200,000, an overall cut of 75%. Now that the House has voted, the Senate Appropriations Committee meets tomorrow to decide on its figure. And when the full Senate votes next week, the experts believe it will go along with the $200,000 the House voted. The House has demonstrated that in an election year, it is politically popular to vote against a departed president. Ray Scherer, NBC News, Washington.
Last summer, most congressmen up for re-election considered that their vote on the impeachment of Richard Nixon would be the most dangerous of their political careers. But, as things turned out, only members of the House Judiciary Committee had to vote on impeachment. Among them, David Dennis, Republican of Indiana, and Edward Mezvinsky, Democrat of Iowa. Catherine Mackin reports on how their votes have affected their political fortunes.
Remember this man, Ed Mezvinsky? He was one of 38 members on the House Judiciary Committee to first investigate and then vote to impeach Richard Nixon. From the beginning, politicians looked on impeachment as political dynamite that would end up with some voters holding it against them if they supported impeachment and others holding it against them if they did not. But it didn't turn out that way. Not here in Mezvinsky's district and not in general for other Judiciary Committee members. Impeachment is not an issue, although the presidential pardon is, so is inflation and the government money going towards Mr. Nixon's support in San Clemente.
Yeah. I don't want to pay for Richard Nixon's staff and expenses and travel and postage and telephone calls for the next few years.
If anything, Mezvinsky thinks he was helped politically by the impeachment investigation. Because of television, more voters than ever know who he is.
People recognize me more. I think the name Mezvinsky was pretty well known in this district. But as far as the recognition, more people know me by face.
My name's Jim Leach. I'm running for Congress.
His opponent, Republican Jim Leach, disagreed.
On the one hand, Congressman Mezvinsky, my opponent, has become exceedingly well known because of impeachment. On the other, many people didn't feel that he really handled himself all that well.
Yet in his campaign speeches, Leach never criticizes Mezvinsky's work on impeachment. It is not an issue. A similar situation exists in Indiana for Representative David Dennis. Dennis is a conservative Republican. He was one of Richard Nixon's chief defenders until that last condemning tape. Then he switched to vote for impeachment. Dennis says his voters support what he did and the way he did it. He too feels he was helped politically by television coverage of the impeachment investigation.
On balance, I think it's been very helpful. For one thing, I have a wide recognition factor thanks to you people on the television.
Hi there.
His opponent, Democrat Philip Sharp, disagrees. He says Dennis came off poorly on television, looking as though he were blindly defending Richard Nixon.
I think it's helped us because I think a lot of people didn't like the way Mr. Dennis handled himself by just taking the party line.
But Dennis doesn't seem worried. Besides, he feels the televised impeachment proceedings made him better known to voters than his 6 years of service in Congress.
Every member of Congress running for re-election looked on the impeachment of Richard Nixon as a political cross they had to bear. Nobody ever expected that instead it would turn out to be a blessing. Catherine Mackin, NBC News, Cambridge City, Indiana.
Congress backed down today on legislation to ban military aid to Turkey. A Senate-House Conference Committee voted 6-1 to allow the president to give arms to the Turks if he's convinced they are trying to act in good faith to end the Cyprus crisis. The Senate had added this military aid ban to a resolution providing money for a number of federal programs, and President Ford promised to veto the bill if it was sent to him with that amendment. And the group today also killed another amendment forbidding military aid to Chile. Mrs. Betty Ford is recovering from cancer surgery 2 or 3 days ahead of schedule. That report came from the president after his last visit to the hospital. Mrs. Ford's surgeon described her recuperation so far as excellent.
These men are helping Exxon provide energy, but they're not oilmen. They're welders, pipe fitters, machinists, and construction workers. and the job they're doing is a vital one. Exxon and its partner are constructing a huge platform that will go to sea to produce oil. When this platform is completed and raised on end, it will stand in 275 feet of water. To build it has taken over 3 years of design, engineering, and construction, and over $25 million. Next to it, the legs of an even bigger platform are taking shape. This one will stand 555 feet high in deeper water and cost nearly $100 million. So you see, the job of producing oil offshore today is a big one, and an expensive one. No matter whether you're looking off the coast of Scotland or Malaysia, or Louisiana, or Texas, or California, or Alaska.
In New York, the Dow Jones Industrials fell past a significant psychological landmark today. They went down almost 14 points on the New York Stock Exchange, and the average closed a little over 587. That's the lowest point in 12 years. And the 4 major American auto manufacturers reported today that new car sales in the last 10 days of September were down 40% from sales in the same period 1 year ago. President Ford got his top economic advisors together again today for help in drafting the anti-inflation program he plans to put forth next week. Federal Energy Administrator John Sawhill yesterday proposed a big increase in gasoline taxes, coupling that with an income tax credit. But as we learned from Tom Brokaw, the president would rather not go in that direction.
President Ford's meeting late this afternoon with his new Labor Management Advisory Board was the latest in a series of discussions that he's been having as he prepares to announce his major economic proposals to Congress early next week. The president also met today with his Economic Policy Board, and the subject was taxes. But before that meeting even began, Press Secretary Ron Nessen said that Mr. Ford still is opposed to any increase in gas taxes, even when those gas taxes may be returned or rebated under certain conditions. Nessen also said that the president will spend most of his working time between now and next Tuesday considering the 100 or so recommendations that came out of the Economic Summit meeting. According to the press secretary, the president has made some tentative choices, but no one at the White House would confirm what they are. Tom Brokaw, NBC News, at the White House.
The FBI reported some disturbing new crime figures today. It said serious crime went up 16% in the first 6 months of this year. There were small decreases in the same period of the 2 preceding years. Murder, rape, robbery, and assault went up 6% in the newest reporting period. Burglary, larceny, and vehicle theft were up 17%. Last week, severe frosts were reported in parts of the Midwest, further damaging the corn and soybean crops. This week, it was reported the frost damage area has spread to a number of other states. For some time now, this program has kept an inflation watch, a series of reports on what inflation is doing to American families with differing incomes. Tonight, Phil Brady reports on Mrs. Jane Weintraub, who is elderly and a widow.
We are all mortals. We will all reach an age at which we become senior citizens if we live long enough. And then we too must face up to the fact that we live with what we've got or make sacrifices and diminish our way of living.
At 77, Mrs. Jane Weintraub has made sacrifices, and her life has diminished. A widow, she lives in New York City on Social Security, $249.20 a month. About $160 of it goes for rent and utilities, $12 or so for medicine, $25 for small essentials such as soap and bus fare, and the rest, about $40 or $50 a month, goes for food, and that leaves nothing for clothing.
I can't really tell you when I bought either a blouse or a skirt or a pair of shoes. I think I bought my last pair of shoes 3 years ago, and I wear old pairs for every day. Providing they're comfortable, I don't care how they look anymore.
Mrs. Weintraub has not bought a new coat in 10 years.
What does it do to a person to stand outside the store, open your bag, and look in and say to yourself, do I cross that threshold with a feeling of security, confidence that what I will want I could buy and pay for? Or will I go in there and start to look for all the cheaper ones of the sale items and deny myself, pass by as if those things did not exist? Naturally, you get a feeling that you're not as worthy a human being as you were at one time.
Inflation has affected Mrs. Weintraub's sense of identity and pride, and it's taught her some new lessons, too.
One of the things we have learned to do, read the labels now. We learn to add and subtract. It's almost sinful to walk into a store and spend $4 or $5 for a steak. And you know very well that a small steak will only last for one meal. And that would be really out of reach for anyone who has to live on a limited income such as Social Security affords me.
A chicken provides Mrs. Weintraub with at least 4 meals, and that's why she buys it. She knows how far anything else she picks will go, too. The only problem, though, is money and how far it will go. And if what she has doesn't go far enough, even to buy only the bare minimum, then she must choose among them. The rest is left behind for someone else who won't have to choose.
I think it's unjust to, for a woman or man to get to the later years and discover that he has to bargain with life for the things that should come to him naturally as a result of the amount of energy and time, effort, and service that he has given to his society.
With tonight's report on Mrs. Weintraub, we complete this series on what inflation is doing to Americans. But it doesn't end our inflation watch. We'll be going back to Mrs. Weintraub and to the other families you've seen from time to time to find out how they're coping with inflation. The Defense Department today disclosed that the Russians have a new long-range submarine missile, very long range. 2 of them were fired yesterday from a Soviet submarine in the Barents Sea north of Moscow, and they landed in the Pacific nearly 5,000 miles away. The longest-range American submarine missile in use today has a limit of about 3,000 miles. Robert Goralski of our staff says the previous top range of Soviet submarine missiles was 1,600 miles. The range of this new missile gives the Russians the ability to stay in their home waters and still, he says, be able to strike at targets in the northern part of the United States. In Santo Domingo today, there was a surprise development in the story of the siege at the Venezuelan consulate. Since last Friday, left-wing guerrillas have been holding hostages in the consulate, including the head of the U.S. Information Service in the Dominican Republic. The guerrillas' original demand was for $1 million and the release of 37 political prisoners in Dominican jails. The authorities wouldn't give in. And today, the guerrilla leader dropped his demand for the $1 million and said fewer than 37 prisoners could be released from jail. There was no immediate response from the Dominican government. In Italy today, Premier Mariano Rumor turned in his resignation and the government fell. The reason was a crisis caused by Italy's acute economic troubles and by a strong bid for power by Italy's Communist Party. Rumor's government was the 36th to fall since World War II, but not in many years has a government in Italy fallen because of such desperate economic conditions. And in Portugal today, which is going through a political upheaval, the new president and the new prime minister extended their power over the Portuguese military. This comes in the wake of the ouster by left-wing generals of President Antonio de Spinola. Bernard Kaplan has a report on who benefited from de Spinola's fall from power.
Since last April's revolution, Portugal has seen hundreds of political demonstrations. But those marking President Antonio Spinola's resignation under left-wing pressure were different. They were strictly Communist Party affairs. The Communists celebrated because Spinola's retirement was above all a victory for them. The demonstrations they organized also made clear how strong and disciplined they have become since they emerged from underground only 5 months ago. It is not political plots, but Portuguese poverty that forms the real basis of the Communists' apparent growing success. Democracy may have arrived here at last spring, but so far it has had little visible impact on the meager living standards of most Portuguese. In spite of some wage increases, many workers are actually worse off than they were before the revolution. Inflation, running at 25% a year, is the heaviest in Europe. Only the Communists consistently give an impression of being vitally concerned by the day-to-day difficulties of ordinary people. The local party headquarters acts as a combination social club and neighborhood counseling service. It's a new and refreshing experience for the Portuguese, the first time in their history that a political party has seemed to care about their individual worries. The military still run things here, but increasingly they have been compelled to take the communist demands into consideration. The disappearance of General Spinola is proof of this. More than anything else, he was regarded here as a break against the decisive spread of communist influence.
The communists have certainly not yet achieved power, but they're now at least one step closer to it. And there's not much doubt that sooner or later they're going to go after it in earnest. Bernard Kaplan, NBC News, Lisbon.
Peru was hit by a severe earthquake today. The government said at least 20 people were known to have been killed, and that number may get larger when reports come in from the countryside. Scott Joplin has been dead for 57 years, and today he's one of the most popular composers in America. The rags he wrote around the turn of the century have an innocence and a style that represent the very best in American music. But for a long time, Scott Joplin was ignored. His grave in New York City was ignored, but recently there's been a change. Today, a group of music lovers assembled at the grave to put up a little plaque and leave some flowers. Here's how that went, and we have added a little Scott Joplin music to help the mood. Frank Robinson was named today to manage the Cleveland Indians. That makes him the first black man in history to manage a Major League Baseball team. Robinson was given a one-year contract for about $180,000, which makes him the highest-paid manager in baseball. And he will continue to play, not full-time, but as a designated hitter. Richard Hammer has the story.
For as long as he can remember, baseball has been the only real interest of Frank Robinson. He's been a major leaguer for 19 years, fulfilling a dream that began in high school.
The funny part about it, I told one of my teachers that I was going to be a big league baseball player. And she said, no way. I said, I am. I'm going to be a big league baseball player. I said, I'm going to sign for $75,000 and I'm going to buy you a car. And I became a big league baseball player, but I fell a little short of the $75,000.
As a player, Robinson has been one of the best. He led Cincinnati and Baltimore in 5 World Series and was the only man to win the Most Valuable Player award in both major leagues. The 39-year-old Texas native began preparing for the future by studying his managers and getting on-the-job training as manager of Sam Tercy in the Puerto Rican Winter League.
And one of the most important things, one of the two, is handling of the players, handling the men, and also communicating with them and motivating them, to get the most out of them. And the strategy comes later.
The manager he studied most closely was Earl Weaver of the Baltimore Orioles.
Earl Weaver was the type of manager, to me, that gets the most out of his 25 ball players. He's not afraid to make a move. He's not afraid to be criticized in the press about making a move or not making a move. And when you come to the ballpark, even if you're not in the starting lineup, you have to figure, well, before this game's over, I might be in there, so I'm ready.
He was a leader by the things he did on the field. Now, I think he can also be a leader, sitting up maybe behind a desk or coming up with the right words possibly when they're needed.
Robinson inherits a young Cleveland team, and most of the players don't know him too well.
I really don't know Frank that well. If he is a manager, it'll be his first big league experience, and who knows?
he'll probably be a good manager. He's got good credentials in winter ball. It remains to be seen what he's going to do up here, of course, but I've got a lot of good feelings about it, really, I do.
As the first black manager of a major league team, Robinson spoke today of the challenge he faces.
I don't see any real pressures as far as I'm concerned being the first black manager. I don't see any goals I have to achieve as being the first black manager. I know outsiders, the public, the press, and other black people are going to put an awful lot of pressure on me because of that. But they can do that, but the pressure from within me is not there. The only thing that I'm going to have to do is go out here and be the manager of this ball club and do the best job that I can do.
Dick Hammer, NBC News, Cleveland.
No doubt that's the way Frank Robinson wants to be looked at, but the fact remains he is a black man and the first to manage a Major League Baseball team, and whatever he says, that's a milestone. Good night for NBC News.
NBC Nightly News has been brought to you by Exxon.